Govinda, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Namaste Narasimhaya, Prahlad Laddaini, Hiranyakashipurvakshaha, Shilatanka Nakhalai, Ito Narsimha Parito Narsimha, Yato Yato Yami Tato Narsimha, Bahi Narsimho Hridaye Narsimha, Narsingamadim Sharanam Prapade, Tava Karakamalavare Nakamadbhuta Shringam, Dalita Hiranyakashipu Tanubhringam, Keshavadrita Narahari Rupa, Jai Jagadish Hare, Jai Jagadish Hare, Jai Jagadish Hare. गोविंदाय तुलसी दिव्याय प्रियाय केशवस्य कृष्ण भक्ति प्रद देवी सत्यवते नमो नमः, नमो नमः। तुलसी कृष्ण प्रेयसी नमो नमः, राधा कृष्ण सेवा पावो हे अभिलाषी, जे तुम्हार शरण लाय तारा वांछा पूर्ण कृपा करी कर तारे वृंदावन वासी, मोरे अभिलाष विलास कुंजे दियो वास, नयने हेरिबो सदा युगल रूपरासी, हे निवेदन धर सखेर अनुगत कर, सेवाधिकार दिए कर निज दासी, बिना कृष्ण दासे कहे नाम रह, श्री राधा गोविंदा प्रेम सदा न भासी, यानि कानि च पापानि महत्यधिकानि च, तानि तानि प्रणश्यन्ति प्रदक्षिणा पदे पदे, यानि कानि च पापानि ब्रह्महत्यधिकानि च, तानि तानि प्रणश्यन्ति प्रदक्षिणा पदे पदे, हरे कृष्णा 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे। वृंदाय तुलसी दिव्याय प्रियाय केशवस्य कृष्ण भक्ति प्रद देवी सत्यवते नमो नमः।
Yes, Guru Maharaj.
You read the table of contents.
Table of content.
What is the reasons?
Yeah, Maharaj. Parts are there, not chapters.
Okay, just read.
Read from the final.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Part 4, 1978 to 1998. Srila Prabhupada's dream.
Go behind.
Go behind, okay. The final phase 75 to 77. More back.
Chipiwala.
Chipiwala. Homeless in Delhi.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, Maharaj, I'm preparing that 26 March drama from this book only. I've read this book. Yes. ओम अज्ञानतिमिरन्धस्य ज्ञानाञ्जनशलाकया चक्षुरुन्मिलितं येन तस्मै श्रीगुरवे नमः। नमो ओम विष्णुपदाय कृष्णपृष्ठाय भूतले श्रीमते भक्तिवेदांत स्वामिनिति नामिने नमस्ते सारस्वती देवे गौरवाणी प्रचारिणे निर्विशेष शून्यवादी पाश्चात्य देशतारिणे। Homeless in Delhi. Having been abruptly forced to leave the Gaudiya Mutt, Srila Prabhupada found himself on the streets of Delhi, penniless and without any place to stay. Out of their kindness, a number of Delhi's residents who had met Srila Prabhupada during his short stay in the city came forward to provide him with both food and shelter. They were of the opinion that Srila Prabhupada was a genuine sadhu, as well as an erudite Vedic scholar. And being religious-minded Hindus, they felt privileged that they could offer their help to such a noble and saintly person. In this way, Srila Prabhupada would spend a few days at one gentleman's residence, and then a few more days at another's, and in this way, he managed to survive. During this difficult period, regardless of his almost penniless and homeless existence, Srila Prabhupada continued preaching Lord Krishna's transcendental message wherever he went, and also continued to write articles whenever he got the chance. During this trying time, he also spent a number of days staying in a room at the Kapoor College of Commerce, and on another occasion, he spent a few days in a room at a local Vishnu temple.
You find out in Delhi, where is Kapoor?
This Kapoor College of Commerce?
Yeah.
Where it is, Maharaj?
We will find out.
We have to find out. Okay. I'll try, Maharaj. Srila Prabhupada continued to receive support from the pious people of Delhi, and thanks to them, he managed to survive what was the most testing time of his entire life. Those early days in Delhi were extremely difficult, and it was certainly a very severe test of his faith and determination to fulfill the order of his spiritual master. Despite the many reversals that he had to face, Srila Prabhupada's faith in Lord Krishna did not diminish even slightly, but instead it increased dramatically, because he knew that it was only by the Lord's special mercy that he was able to continue with his preaching mission due to the help provided by the pious people of Delhi. Undaunted by his near beggarly existence, Srila Prabhupada, always remembering the order of his Guru Maharaj, continued to write articles and essays in English, and was always enthusiastic to preach about Krishna consciousness to anyone who was eager to listen. And although who heard Srila Prabhupada speak on the philosophy of the Gita and the Bhagavatam were greatly impressed by his deep understanding of the subject, his knowledge of Sanskrit, his scholarly presentation, and his absolute faith in Guru and Krishna. Revival of Back to Godhead magazine. Srila Prabhupada, who was always brimming with enthusiasm to preach, would regularly visit many of Delhi's leading businessmen, industrialists, educators, religious leaders, judges, lawyers, government officials, and a host of political luminaries in the hope of convincing them about the importance of spreading India's Vedic culture, not only in India, but more importantly, all over the world. Srila Prabhupada also attempted to garner donations from these gentlemen for printing books and for restarting his magazine, back to Godhead. The Vedas say that it is the duty of all sadhus and holy men to engage the common men in works of religious merit, like publishing books and building temples. This not only helps to spread the glories of the Supreme Lord, but greatly benefits the donors and the people in general, and is one of the few ways in which wealthy materialistic people can be engaged in religious acts. In olden days, most Indians were eager to give donations to sadhus in order to purify themselves from the sinful contaminations of materialistic life and to make advancement on the path back to Godhead. It was quite common for every wealthy person to print hundreds of copies of books like the Bhagavad Gita and distribute them freely amongst the masses. Although India was changing due to the influence of gross materialism and the people were becoming eager to amass great personal wealth, nevertheless, Srila Prabhupada always tried to engage everyone he met in serving the mission of spreading Lord Krishna's transcendental message. Over the next 4 months, Srila Prabhupada's undying desire to continue to preach regardless of his personal difficulties eventually began to bear fruit. With the support of some very favorable trustees of the Birla Mandir, Srila Prabhupada was able to organize a public gathering at the Trust's famous Lakshmi Narayan Mandir in Delhi on December 22nd, 1955, which Srila Prabhupada advertised in the Hindustan Times. The meeting was presided over by the then President of the Delhi Municipal Committee, Mr. R.N. Agarwal, and was attended by many respectable gentlemen of Delhi. All those in attendance appreciated the scholarly discourse given by Srila Prabhupada, in which he discussed Vedic philosophy and the great relevance in today's world of scriptures like Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam. Because of the successful program held at the Birla Mandir, Srila Prabhupada had managed to raise sufficient donations to again publish his Back to Godhead magazine. During the chilly winter mornings of January 1956, without a chadar or any warm clothing, wearing just a thin cotton jacket and cotton hat, and without taking any breakfast, Srila Prabhupada walked all the way to the printers in Old Delhi. Rather than taking a bus or rickshaw in order to save money, and would spend the morning hours checking the proofs of the magazine and making the necessary corrections. The proprietor of the press, Surinder Kumar Jain, was amazed at the austerities Srila Prabhupada underwent in order to print his Back to Godhead magazine and his unflinching enthusiasm to preach the message of Lord Krishna. He saw that Srila Prabhupada had very little money, but whatever he did collect by ways of donations, he never wasted it on his own needs, but would instead spend every penny for printing his Back to Godhead magazine. Knowing that Srila Prabhupada was not taking any breakfast, Mr. Jain would arrange a little breakfast to be brought from his house, which Srila Prabhupada graciously accepted while reading through the proofs of his magazine. Surinder Kumar Jain. My first impression was that he was a nice person and straightforward. I felt pity also because of the conditions under which he would come. I know he didn't have even 25 paisa. He would come all the way on foot and without any breakfast or anything. He would come in the morning to the press, and when I would ask him, Swamiji, did you have anything to eat this morning? He would say, oh no, Mr. Jain, I just came because I had to see the proofs. That's all right, I would say. I will get breakfast for you. I would call for breakfast and then he would sit and walk. He would do the proofreading himself. The printing was done by me, and most of the time he would like to be present when that final printing was being done. He would come in the morning around 7 and stay until he had seen all the proofs. It was a regular thing that he would come without breakfast I would arrange for breakfast and he would sit across the table from one another for hours together. He was always talking on religious subjects only. But when he would be sitting, especially when waiting for the proofs to come, he would discuss many things. I felt that he knew quite a lot because he was a well-read person. He was more a friend than just a person coming to get things printed. He was a very simple man, straightforward in his habits. But his mission at that time was particularly to further the movement of back to Godhead. His financial condition was very, very weak. Sometimes the printing would be difficult because he was not able to arrange for the paper. Many times I told him that if he was feeling difficulty, why was he continuing? But he said, no, it is my mission and I will always carry it on as far as possible. I tried to accommodate him to the maximum possible extent, but he was a real pauper. I only did the printing and he had to arrange for the paper. So sometimes it was delayed. Although my job was printing, sometimes I would say, all right, you are so keen, I will give you the paper. But usually he would arrange for it himself. Since we only did printing, he would bring it in a rickshaw. We were not uncomfortable together, but as business would have it. If the bills were standing for a long time, then I would ask him if he could do something about it. He would say, don't worry, you can be sure that your money is coming. I never asked him where his funds were coming from because I felt that it was his personal matter. But it was embarrassing for him when he could not pay, so I never tried to embarrass him. He was concerned that if he didn't have money, how could he print the paper? And he definitely wanted to run that paper. He wanted to preach the teachings of the Gita. He thought of it as a sort of movement, that it was the only way that people in the world could find peace. His conviction was very strong. During the year 1956, Srila Prabhupada was producing Back to Godhead magazine on a regular basis, thanks to the contributions he received from the pious and religious-minded people of Delhi. Srila Prabhupada would personally distribute the copies of Back to Godhead, firstly to the various donors who contributed to the printing, and then on the streets of Delhi, as well as to shopkeepers, business establishments, and to various offices located around the city center. On some occasions, although he never touched tea himself, being a strict Vaishnava, he would visit the many tea shops where office workers and government servants would congregate during their break and distribute his Back to Godhead magazines amongst them. Srila Prabhupada would also mail out copies of the magazines to friends, acquaintances, and prospective donors in different parts of India. Although it began as a simple 4-page pamphlet-style magazine containing articles and essays written exclusively by Srila Prabhupada, the importance of the Back to Godhead magazine could never be minimized on the grounds that it was just a magazine. It was in fact an important introduction to Krishna consciousness for hundreds and thousands of people who would otherwise never have read books like the Bhagavad Gita or Srimad Bhagavatam. In the Western world, when Back to Godhead was first published there, it gained the status of a new age magazine, and its sales worldwide eventually reached a staggering 1 million copies every month. Spreading Krishna's message in Delhi. Having surmounted the difficulties of his first year in the capital, although still without any fixed abode, Srila Prabhupada had already achieved considerable success in his preaching and was now producing a monthly edition of Back to Godhead magazine. On November 21st, 1956, Srila Prabhupada sent all of the previously printed editions of the magazine to Dr. Rajendra Prasad, the then President of India, along with a letter requesting him to at least read the headlines of the magazine, which concerned the decline of spiritual values amongst the general population. Srila Prabhupada also requested Dr. Rajendra Prasad to grant him an interview so they would discuss the propagation of India's spiritual heritage among the citizens of India. Unfortunately, there was no response to Srila Prabhupada's letter. A friend and well-wisher of Srila Prabhupada and one of the donors of Back to Godhead magazine, the former High Court Judge, Justice Bipin Chandra Mishra, once said that he did not think that Srila Prabhupada would have much of an impact on the people of Delhi, because he chose to preach and write in English rather than in Hindi, the local language of most Delites. Justice Mishra. He used to come to me once a month. I gave him donations for his paper. It was only a 4-page magazine, but it showed his study of the subject and his earnestness and his devotion to Lord Krishna. Yes, Maharaj. He appeared to be a very simple man and modest, and it was pleasant to talk to him. He had a smiling demeanor. The main thing was his humility. He would talk with affection and confidence, and he knew we were discussing things near to God. So every talk with him would sublimate us. I was a rather important personality at that time in religious affairs, but he would not be expected to make any contribution to the main religious life of Delhi at that time. Because of language difficulty, because his aim was to reach the English educated persons, not the Hindi ones. And also because his means and his popularity were not at all established, the magazine did not have a wide appeal among these people. Other religious leaders were all well established. The only thing that impressed one and was worth noticing at that time was the simplicity of his abiding faith in God's name and his mission. Srila Prabhupada had received the order from his spiritual master to preach in the English language, and although it was certainly very difficult in a Hindi-speaking city, he was duty-bound to preserve the continuing his efforts to propagate Lord Krishna's message by writing in English. Although Justice Mishra has long since passed on, he would certainly have been surprised not only at the great success that Srila Prabhupada eventually achieved, but also how many millions of Indians, and in particular Delites, are today speaking and reading in the English language. In fact, all higher education in India is now predominantly educated in the English language. Regardless of whatever negative responses he might have received, undaunted, Srila Prabhupada continued with his mission to preach Lord Krishna's message in the English language and continued to produce his monthly magazine Back to Godhead. On one occasion, while out distributing his Back to Godhead magazines on the streets of Delhi, Srila Prabhupada was gored and knocked to the ground by a rampaging cow and was forced to take bed rest. However, within days, he was back on the streets distributing his magazine just as before. On another occasion, later that same year, during the intense summer heat that afflicts Delhi, with temperature hovering around 44 degrees centigrade, Srila Prabhupada began to feel suddenly very weak and dizzy and was on the verge of collapsing in the street due to the effects of heat stroke. Fortunately, at that very moment, one of the regular donors of Back to Godhead magazine, who knew Srila Prabhupada, was passing by his car, and seeing that Srila Prabhupada was experiencing some difficulty, took him in his car and drove him to the nearest doctor. After thoroughly checking Srila Prabhupada, the doctor advised him to rest for a number of days. But as soon as Srila Prabhupada had recovered sufficiently, he was back on the streets of Delhi, distributing his Back to Godhead magazine once again. The many reversals and hardships that Srila Prabhupada had faced since accepting Vanaprastha certainly tested his resolve and determination to continue preaching the message of Lord Krishna. However, these same reversals and hardships would ultimately prepare Srila Prabhupada for the future, when he would have to endure the loneliness of living in a foreign land, amid the inhospitable people of a highly materialistic and morally descendant culture. What to speak of the surviving in the freezing cold winters of New York City, with its bitingly cold winds, snow and ice, when in the future he would arrive on the shores of America, where his great test still awaited him. Finding refuge in Vrindavan. Towards the end of 1956, Srila Prabhupada visited the holy city of Vrindavan, and by Lord Krishna's mercy, the Mahant of the Vanshi Gopal Mandir, whom Srila Prabhupada had first met on a previous visit to Vrindavan in 1953, offered Srila Prabhupada a permanent residence in a first-floor room at the Vanshi Gopal Mandir. The temple was located near Keshi Ghat, just a few minutes' walk from the medieval temple of Radha Gokulananda, Radha Raman and Radha Gopinath. It was a perfect place for Srila Prabhupada to find a permanent refuge. Srila Prabhupada had visited Vrindavan on a number of previous occasions, starting in 1925 with his family, and then again in 1932 when he met his spiritual master Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami at Kosi during the Gaudiya Math's annual Vrajmandal Parikrama. Then again in 1935 he had met Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati for the very last time at Radhakund, just 1 year before his spiritual master disappeared from the world. During that last meeting, his spiritual master advised him that if he ever got sufficient funds, he should print books rather than build temples, as books had a far greater impact on the population and was the most effective way of spreading the teachings of Lord Krishna. On December 13, 1936, just 18 days before his disappearance from the world, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati wrote a letter to Srila Prabhupada asking him to preach the message of Lord Chaitanya in the English language. This was the final order that Srila Prabhupada received from his spiritual master. It confirmed all the previous instructions he had received about preaching in the English language, starting from their very first meeting in 1922. Although Srila Prabhupada had now found a permanent residence in Vrindavan, nevertheless, he continued to travel by the early morning train to Delhi, where he continued with his preaching work, distributing his Back to Godhead magazine, and raised funds for printing further editions of the magazine. Srila Prabhupada would either spend the night in Delhi or return to Vrindavan by the evening train. However, by January 1957, having successfully printed over 12 consecutive editions of his Back to Godhead magazine, Srila Prabhupada had run out of funds, and unable to find another donor, he was forced to stop further printing. Being unable to continue Back to Godhead magazine, Srila Prabhupada decided to remain in Vrindavan and concentrate on his writing. Thus, in order to sustain his simple existence, Srila Prabhupada performed the age-old tradition amongst mendicants known as Madhukari. The performance of Madhukari, which literally means collecting honey like a bee from flower to flower, is a spiritual practice undertaken by holy men for maintaining the body and soul. The practice also involves the development of humility by begging alms from door to door and accepting only a small amount from each house so as not to burden the householder. The householders would usually give chapatis or raw flour, rice and lentils, which the holy men would either soak in water or cook on a fire. This practice is ordained in the Vedic scripture from all mendicants, including brahmacharis, vanaprasthas and sannyasis. Each morning, Srila Prabhupada, while carrying his small begging bowl and his umbrella, would first take darshan at the Radha Damodar Mandir, and then after performing Madhukari, would go for darshan to the Radha Raman Mandir, and then chant japa while sitting beside the samadhi of Gopal Bhatta Goswami. He would then return to the Vanshi Gopal Mandir just before noon to honor the prasadam that he has received while performing Madhukari. During the next 2 years from 1957, Srila Prabhupada continued to write articles as well as prepare manuscripts for future books. He would also go on parikrama to the various temples of Vrindavan both morning and evening. Life in Vrindavan was very peaceful and also spiritually rejuvenating, especially after the severe hardships he had faced since accepting the Vanaprastha ashram. During his time staying in Vrindavan, Srila Prabhupada also received various invitations to attend preaching engagements in such places like Bombay, Kanpur and Kurukshetra, which he has accepted and gave several discourses on the Gita and the Bhagavatam. Prabhupada writes to Jawaharlal Nehru. In the month of August 1958, Srila Prabhupada wrote a letter to the then Prime Minister of India, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, expressing concern that the people of India, under the leadership of the modern politicians, were rejecting their own spiritual culture and imitating the culture of the Europeans and Americans. Srila Prabhupada was familiar with Pandit Nehru and his family because the Nehru family hailed from Allahabad and has always purchased their medicines from the pharmacy owned by Srila Prabhupada when he was a businessman in his householder days at Allahabad. In the letter, Srila Prabhupada glorified the ideal life epitomized by such leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Chanakya Pandit, who lived very simply and promoted Vedic culture. Srila Prabhupada proposed to Nehru that it was the responsibility of political leaders to guide the masses on the path of spiritualism, as Gandhi had tried to do. However, there were no reply from Nehru. Unfortunately, Pandit Nehru and his fellow political leaders had already decided to lead India down the path of westernized materialism that included massive industrialization of the country. In one of his well-known speeches, Nehru had boldly declared that the factories would be the new temples of modern India. It was Mahatma Gandhi who had led India to independence and had envisioned that once the British were out of India, there could be a spiritual revival of Vedic culture in the country, and the Bhagavad Gita, of which the Mahatma was a devout follower, could be taught in all the schools across the subcontinent. He had also said that there should be a temple built in every single village of India to help the revival of spiritualism and Indian culture. And that economic development should start from the village level first in order to bring relief to the suffering masses of India. Unfortunately, for Mahatma Gandhi as well as Indian religious and culture, Nehru and his supporters never intended to fulfill Gandhiji's desire for the spiritual upliftment of India. During the period of his stay in Vrindavan, Srila Prabhupada continued to regularly visit Delhi to continue with his preaching work in the capital. On one such visit to Delhi in October 1958, he received a generous donation from a pious city businessman for printing Back to Godhead magazine. He therefore immediately printed 1,000 copies for an October edition, the first edition to appear in almost 2 years, and then personally distributed all the copies himself. After the success of the October edition, Srila Prabhupada received yet another donation for the November issue, which he immediately printed and distributed himself. After printing these 2 editions, Srila Prabhupada was unable to raise further donations, and therefore during the next 6 months, Srila Prabhupada mostly stayed in Vrindavan. In July 1959, the Mahant of the Radha Damodar Mandir in Vrindavan informed Srila Prabhupada that he had some vacant rooms and invited him to stay there. Srila Prabhupada considered that the chance to stay at the Radha Damodar Mandir was most auspicious, because the Radha Damodar Mandir has been established by Srila Jiva Goswami and was the place where Srila Rupa Goswami had written many of his important books, including the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Nectar of Devotion. This ancient temple has also been Rupa Goswami's spiritual headquarters for spreading Lord Chaitanya's Sankirtan movement, and the place where the 6 Goswamis of Vrindavan would regularly meet to discuss transcendental topics. Srila Prabhupada believed it was an ideal place for him to reside and write his English translation of the Srimad Bhagavatam. Without hesitation and looking forward to living in a close association of both Rupa and Jiva Goswamis, Srila Prabhupada immediately accepted the offer to move his residence to the Radha Damodar Mandir. Prabhupada takes sannyas. One night, while asleep in his room at the Radha Damodar Mandir, Srila Prabhupada had an amazing dream. It was the same dream he had earlier in his life, just after the first meeting with his spiritual master in 1922. In the dream, Srila Prabhupada suddenly saw the tall and elegant figure of his spiritual master, Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami, descending from the spiritual world and calling Srila Prabhupada to follow him. Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati was repeatedly calling him to follow in his footsteps and become a sannyasi. On walking from the dream, Srila Prabhupada felt ecstatic and realized that his spiritual master had personally appeared before him, giving him direct instructions to take sannyas. It was the same dream he had seen on 2 previous occasions when he was a newly married young man with a family to look after. But at that time, Srila Prabhupada had been horrified at the thought of having to leave his young wife and small children behind in order to live the renounced and austere life of a sannyasi. But now things had changed. The idea of taking sannyas now seemed to be a very good idea. He felt extremely blessed that his spiritual master had once again backwarned him to take sannyas. In the Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya, to which Srila Prabhupada and his spiritual master both belong, acceptance of the sannyas ashram is recommended for those who wish to preach the message of love of God amongst the innocent masses. The order of sannyas is the 4th and last stage in the Vedic religious system known as Varnashram Dharma, and Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the golden avatar, also took sannyas in order to preach the divine message of love of God. Srila Prabhupada decided to accept the order of sannyas from one of his sannyasi godbrothers, and after some deliberation, he informed his close friend at the Gaudiya Mutt in Mathura, Keshav Maharaj, about his intentions. Hearing about his dream, Keshav Maharaj told Srila Prabhupada to immediately take sannyas and also offered to initiate him into the renounced order of life. Thus, at a ceremony at the Mathura Gaudiya Mutt on September 17, 1959, Srila Prabhupada accepted the Tridandi sannyas order from his godbrother Keshav Maharaj and was given the sannyas name A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami. At the time of birth in 1896, Srila Prabhupada's father gave him the same name Abhay, meaning fearless at the lotus feet of Krishna. At the time of his initiation in 1933, Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami gave him the name Abhay Charanar Vind Das. And then in 1939, due to his profound Vedic scholarship, the Gaudiya Vaishnava Society awarded him the title Bhakti Vedanta. After accepting the sannyas order from Keshav Maharaj, he was awarded the title Swami, thus becoming Abhay Charanaravind Bhakti Vedanta Swami. A new chapter in Prabhupada's life. Sometimes after taking sannyas, Srila Prabhupada happened to meet a librarian who advised him that it would far better for him to publish books rather than magazines, as books lasted a very long time, whereas magazines are generally thrown away after having been read only once. Around this same time, Srila Prabhupada also met an officer from an Indian army who had been regularly reading Back to God magazine, and he also advised Srila Prabhupada that it would be better to print books, as they had a far greater value than magazines. Srila Prabhupada took this advice as a direct mercy of his spiritual master. Therefore, Srila Prabhupada decided to concentrate on writing and publishing books. Even though books would be far more time consuming and certainly more costly to print than magazines. Srila Prabhupada decided that he would begin by writing the first ever English translation of the great Vedic classic, the Srimad Bhagavatam, which was considered to be the cream of all Vedic literatures. The Bhagavatam was also Srila Vyasadev's own personal commentary on his famous Vedanta Sutra, the greatest ever treatise on Vedic philosophy. The Srimad Bhagavatam was without doubt the most important of all the Vedic literatures and was also revered by Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who declared it to be the spotless Purana. Lord Chaitanya has advised all Vaishnavas to study daily in order to achieve God realization. In fact, the Bhagavatam is considered to be a literary incarnation of Lord Krishna, and by reading it under the guidance of a pure devotee, one automatically develops pure love for God. Srila Prabhupada concluded that it would take at least 60 volumes to produce the entire Bhagavatam in a thoroughly scholarly manner, with Sanskrit text, English equivalents, and word-for-word synonyms, as well as his own elaborate purports. ISKCON's first office in Delhi. Srila Prabhupada continued to travel regularly to Delhi, sometimes staying overnight at the invitation of old friends and acquaintances. Then, by Lord Krishna's mercy, on one such visit, Srila Prabhupada had been invited to stay at home of Mr. Hitsaran Sharma, the manager of Radha Press, where Srila Prabhupada had some year earlier printed pamphlets and leaflets on behalf of Jhansi's League of Devotees. Mr. Sharma introduced Srila Prabhupada to Pandit Sri Krishna Sharma, a learned scholar, pious Mukinist, and Mahant of the Sri Sri Radha Krishna temple in Old Delhi's Chippiwala area, which was located behind the famous Jama Masjid. Realizing that Srila Prabhupada was a very saintly person and also an erudite Vedic scholar, Sharmaji wanted to help Srila Prabhupada in his missionary activities, and immediately offered Srila Prabhupada a permanent place to stay in Delhi, free of rent, in a room on the upper floor of his temple, to be used as both an office and living quarters whenever Srila Prabhupada was visiting the city. Having obtained the office in Chippiwala at the end of 1959, Srila Prabhupada began his now famous translation of the Srimad Bhagavatam and would spend long hours of the day and night engaged in typing the manuscript. Srila Prabhupada believed that the English edition of the Bhagavatam would form the spiritual and philosophical basis from which he would preach in America. And by selling these books, he could generate enough funds to support himself in America while he established his mission, which he planned to call the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. After taking sannyas, Srila Prabhupada's focus changed, and he began to seriously think of going to America and establishing a worldwide spiritual organization devoted to spreading Krishna consciousness and propagating Lord Chaitanya's Sankirtan movement, which was based on the congregational chanting of the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra. Srila Prabhupada had formulated the name International Society for Krishna Consciousness based on Srila Rupa Goswami's original idea. While living at the Radha Damodar Mandir in Vrindavan, Srila Prabhupada had imbibed Srila Rupa Goswami's conception of an integrated worldwide Vaishnava movement under the banner of Lord Chaitanya's Sankirtan movement. Thus, from his new office at the Radha Krishna Mandir, Srila Prabhupada embarked on a new phase in his life as he began to write the first ever English translation of Srimad Bhagavatam. It can therefore be said that Srila Prabhupada's office in Old Delhi's Chippiwala area, besides being a base in Delhi for printing his books and magazines, was in fact ISKCON's first de facto office. In 1960, Srila Prabhupada published his first ever book, a small paperback edition entitled Easy Journey to Other Planets. The publication of this book occurred after Srila Prabhupada had heard that 2 American scientists had received the Nobel Prize in Physics for discovering the antiproton. This discovery gave rise to speculation in scientific circles about an anti-material world, and coupled with the ongoing space race between the Americans and the Russians after the Russians had launched the world's first satellite called the Sputnik. The media was full of talk about the new frontiers of science and space exploration. Thus, feeling inspired, Srila Prabhupada began writing the book Easy Journey to Other Planets about the transcendental process of Bhakti Yoga and the ability of yogis to travel to other planets. That includes a description of the anti-material spiritual world called Vaikuntha. In August 1960, after raising sufficient donations, Srila Prabhupada published his Easy Journey to Other Planets as a paperback edition with a foreword by Dr. N.K. Siddhanta, the then Vice Chancellor of Delhi University. After publication, Srila Prabhupada received a lot of very good reviews from a number of prominent scientists around India. It was a momentous occasion for Srila Prabhupada as it was the first complete book that he had ever published. When the same book popularly referred to as Easy Journey was later reprinted in America in 1970, it was such a revelation that it created a sensation amongst the younger generation. After reading it, many Americans and Europeans became convinced about the authenticity and scientific basis of Bhakti Yoga, and many were converted to Krishna consciousness and joined Srila Prabhupada's ISKCON movement. During the year 1960, Srila Prabhupada was spending his time between Vrindavan and his Chippiwala office in Delhi. During this period, after receiving some donations from well-wishers, Srila Prabhupada once again began printing the Back to Godhead magazine and was also holding regular discourses on the Srimad Bhagavatam at the residence of Dr. Banerjee, a former director of the National Museum of Delhi. Dr. Banerjee. He used to come to the library and consult some books, and I met him there. He gave me a book called Easy Journey to Other Planets. He gave me some copies to distribute for a rupee or half a rupee each. I felt attracted to him. I thought he was a saintly person with pure devotion and without any outward glamour. He was not out to attract people just for name and fame. He had little support from anybody. He was living alone in a small room in Chippiwala. He was devoted to his studies. So I asked him, "Sir, if you have time and you don't mind coming to my house, could you kindly come on Sundays and recite the Bhagavatam in my house?" He readily agreed. He was a good scholar. He was learned in the scriptures, and he was fond of communicating his ideas to others. He was a good speaker and a good conversationalist. He was very polite. Whatever he said very distinctly. He spoke in Bengali and explained the essence of the verses. Sometimes he also referred to the commentaries just to give me more information. The others were not very much interested in commentaries or in difficult aspects, but because he knew that I had some studies in the field, he explained the commentaries for my sake and for the sake of one or two other gentlemen who were also very elderly and very scholarly. The gatherings at my house would be attended by about 20 or 30 people, and he would continue his explanation for 1 or 2 hours. Then he would recite the Hare Krishna mantra, and we would also take part with the kartals and harmonium.